But comrades, on a serious point, you may, given what Zach has just said, that the title of this meeting is the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X and Black Power, you may wonder why we started by showing you clips of Martin Luther King. The reason we started that way is because in just over a couple of months, just over a month actually, we will be marking the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, attended by an estimated 250,000 people, a massive demonstration. And it was the demonstration, of course, at which Dr. Martin Luther King made the famous, iconic, and voted the greatest speech of the 20th century, the I Have a Dream speech. And it's not just that that demonstration was symbolically the high point of the civil rights movement, it also had a tremendous... Is that working?
Yes.
Yeah. It also had an effect in terms of driving the Democratic administration of John F. Kennedy. He died in 1963, but forcing the administration that he initially led into passing two pieces of legislation, the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which in that sense achieved two of the principal goals of the civil rights movement, which were to dismantle the legal, enshrined disenfranchisement and inequality of black people. Dismantling, ordering, through law, through legislation, the dismantling of the Jim Crow system of segregation. So in that sense, the civil rights movement, symbolised by that demonstration, achieved, and which mobilised massive numbers of people on marches, protests and so on, throughout particularly the southern states, actually achieved something, and something fantastically important. I just want to pause a moment and say this as well. Sometimes when you talk about Martin Luther King, people suggest that this guy was some kind of sellout because he compromised with the system. I do think people should stop and reflect upon the fact that this man died in 1968 fighting for what he believed in. So the idea that this is some kind of sellout, that he was some kind of sellout, I think is a terrible slur. So the civil rights movement achieved those two key goals. March on Washington was hugely important, and yet within weeks of that tremendous demonstration, it was absolutely clear that racism was still very much alive and kicking and was not going to be dismantled anytime soon. The most obvious example of it was and this picture highlights it, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, at which a group of small young girls died. One of the classmates, incidentally, one of the classmates of the girls who died was someone with whom we're quite familiar, Condoleezza Rice, who went on to become the Secretary of State. So that bombing symbolised the fact that racism was still alive and kicking. And I would argue that within months, certainly within a couple of years of the March on Washington, it was clear to millions of black people that the civil rights movement, King's movement, was really running out of steam. King himself remained hugely popular personally. People identified with him, people supported him, people continued to support the initiatives that he organised. So he remained hugely popular. The civil rights movement remained tremendously important. But people were beginning to think that it was running out of steam and that there was a need for a newer and a more radical and a more militant strategy. And the person who was most closely associated with was Malcolm X. Malcolm X, somebody who, instead of calling for the non-violent Christian philosophy of the civil rights movement, was identified with a much more radical message. People may be familiar with him using the term, if a racist lays, instead of turning the other cheek to your oppressor, Malcolm argued, if a racist lays his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. The most famous image of him is the image of him stood by a window holding a Kalashnikov or some kind of machine gun, ready to take on the oppressors. Far from a non-violent perspective, a perspective that said blacks should be prepared and willing to defend themselves by any means necessary. He also argued, of course, liberate our minds by any means necessary. And he predicted that there would be explosions across America. And there were indeed explosions across America in the years after the middle years of the decade. I shall come back to that, but I just want to say something about Malcolm in biographical terms, because it probably won't surprise you to know that he wasn't born Malcolm X. He didn't die Malcolm X either. He was born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. He died in 1965 under the name Al-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz. And in a brilliant book, which I'm sure you can get at Bookmarks, may be available at the end of the meeting, a brilliant biography of him by Manning Marable is subtitled A Life of Reinvention. It was a short life, less than 40 years old, but it's an important life that he led, and it's worth knowing a little bit about his background to understand how he developed in the way that he did. He was born the son of parents who themselves were politically active. They were supporters of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association and actually travelled around some of the most challenging parts of the southern states as organisers, politically organising for the United Negro Improvement Association. And so, in the face of the most violent racism at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan. So Malcolm's earliest memories as an infant child was of travelling around with his father to meetings where his father was seeking to mobilise and encourage black people to be active in the fight against their oppression. Another of his earlier memories is, and precisely because his family were political activists, was of their house being burned to the ground by racists. By September 1931, his father was dead. His father died in what officially was considered to be a tragic accident. He fell under a streetcar. Almost certainly, he died at the hands of racists. He was murdered by racists. So and his mother was therefore left on her own to try and raise their family. So these are Malcolm's earliest memories. No surprise that given the horrible oppression and brutality that they faced, his mother was unable to cope and she ended up spending most of her life in a psychiatric asylum. Malcolm, meanwhile, was a very bright boy at school, very popular boy at school, but one of the things that he recalls is when teachers were asking kids what they wanted to be when they grow up. Malcolm said he wanted to be a lawyer and was told, quite frankly, don't be stupid. Aspiring to be a lawyer is no kind of aspiration for a nigger. It's what his teacher said. You're good with your hands, Malcolm, why don't you be a carpenter? Obviously nothing wrong, nothing against carpenters, fantastically skilled, but to be told at that age, don't be stupid, don't have dreams, don't aspire to anything, was a crushing blow for a young man. And it's not surprising, therefore, that Malcolm became increasingly disaffected with school, ended up leaving school, ultimately left the area that he lived in and moved, first of all, to Boston, then to Harlem, and ultimately got involved in petty crime, drug peddling, and so on, and then eventually graduated to burglaries and therefore ultimately wound up going to prison. Sentenced to 10 years in prison for breaking and entering and having guns. It was in prison that he found the Nation of Islam, and this led to, if you like, the second reinvention that Marable talks about in his book. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on the Nation of Islam. I don't have time to do so, but I will just say this very briefly about them. They are a bizarre organisation, an astonishing philosophy that they had, basically, that white people were created in an experiment by a mad scientist called Yakub, and that they managed to escape, seize control of the world, and black people, the original people of the world, had fallen asleep. And therefore what the nation wanted to do was to get black people to wake up, stand up, and reassert our authority and dominance. A crazy philosophy, really, but it's not surprising that it was attractive to many black people in the circumstances in which they were able to grow, partly because in a society as brutally racist as America, where black people were made to feel that they were second, third, fourth class citizens, not real people, to have an organisation that says stand up, be proud to be black, was fantastically important. But also the nation had a specific focus on going into prisons, where of course they would find huge numbers of particularly black men, and having a focus and an orientation on them, not to feel alienated and oppressed, but to feel strong and powerful, and that they had a sense of self-worth. So it was not surprising that they were able to appeal to large numbers of people. And once he joined, Malcolm really threw himself into the organisation. Whilst in prison, he read huge amounts, he educated himself in the politics and philosophy of the nation. And then when he was released, after serving 6 years, he threw himself into the organisation and ultimately became its most charismatic and well-known leader, and therefore became the most, he organised, for example, the mosque in Harlem in New York, which was really the unofficial capital of black America. Now, it's worth seeing, actually, if you haven't seen it, Spike Lee's film Malcolm X, because I think it brilliantly portrays the period when Malcolm was a hustler. It portrays well, I think, his transformation whilst in prison, but it also, I think, characterises the Nation of Islam pretty well, because it shows how, you know, they wore these black suits with bow ties, they looked pretty sharp, short haircuts, they looked like people you don't mess with. And there's one particular scene where one of their brothers has been arrested, and they go to the police station and they look fierce and menacing, and they stay there until their brother is released. It's an impressive scene, but it also shows and I mean this in the literal sense, the sectarianism of the organisation, because they really had nothing to do with and abstained completely from the wider struggles that were taking place, the huge mobilisations that the civil rights movement were involved in. The nation had nothing to do with. The very March on Washington that we saw at the beginning, 250,000 people, you would think that political activists would want to be involved in that. The nation's official response was that their members should have nothing to do with it, shouldn't participate in it, that it was ridiculous to try and compromise with the white power system. Malcolm officially went along with this line, described the March on Washington as a farce on Washington. But the reality is, for somebody who, like him, born, brought up, steeped in struggle from his earliest years, he was a political activist to his core. He wanted to be part of a movement. He really, if you like, secretly admired the ability. He had huge political differences with King and the civil rights movement, but could not but admire their ability to mobilise hundreds of thousands of people. So almost certainly, people like Marable suggest, Malcolm was quietly present at the civil rights movement, the March on Washington, attended the March on Washington. I want to go on to say something else about 1963, because of course another important...
You're doing fine.
Other very important event that happened in 1963, November 1963, was the assassination of the President, John F. Kennedy. Now, you would think, wouldn't you, that an organisation like the Nation of Islam, which completely denounced the white power structure, the government, black people have no place in this white racist land, you would think that they would at least quietly celebrate the demise of John F. Kennedy. Of course, actually, the truth was that the official line of the Nation was that they would say nothing about it. Malcolm was due to give an interview, I think it may have even been the night that Kennedy died, certainly in the days afterwards, and he was specifically instructed by Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation, to say nothing about Kennedy's death. Malcolm was interviewed. Interviewer kept asking him questions, and ultimately he couldn't help himself. And so when he was asked about Kennedy's death, Malcolm said, "The chickens have come home to roost." Now, I'm an old farm boy, and as far as I'm concerned, chickens coming home to roost never made me sad. They made me glad because they meant the good times are coming. In other words, Kennedy was a president of a violent, racist government who prosecuted the war in Vietnam. He died a violent death in the way that he had prosecuted the violence and the murder of millions of people in lands abroad. Malcolm, for saying that, Malcolm was denounced by Elijah Muhammad. They put out, the Nation, a statement to say that Malcolm didn't represent the views of the Nation and that Kennedy was our president too. And so Malcolm was suspended from the organisation. Actually, he never rejoined. That was really was the start of the point of departure for Malcolm from the Nation of Islam. That then led to the next reinvention of him. He went on the Hajj to Mecca. He converted to Orthodox Islam. The Orthodox Islamic institutions had nothing to do with the Nation of Islam. They said it isn't part of the true Islamic faith. So Malcolm went on the Hajj, converted to Islam. That's why he changed his name to Al-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz. And this is an interesting point, because one of the meetings yesterday, there was a contribution that was asking about him moving leftwards, becoming more socialist and so on. It's certainly the case that in the last 18 months of his life, Malcolm was moving, I think, dramatically to the left. One of the things, of course, that was very important was that, amongst other things, through going on the Hajj, he met white Muslims and therefore began to change his ideas about white people. Instead of denouncing all white people as being devils with whom black people could have no contact whatsoever, but once saying to a white woman when she asked what she could contribute to the struggle, "You can contribute nothing, you have no role to play whatsoever." He ended up said that he regretted that. He realised that white people could be allies, not necessarily equal, but allies in the struggle against racism. But it would be wrong to say that he had become a socialist. One of the organisations that he set up two organisations in the last year of his life. There was one called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which was intended to kind of draw people away from the Nation of Islam towards the organisation he was seeking to build. And the other organisation was the Organisation of Afro-American Unity, trying to build links between African Americans and some of the emerging black states. So you think about those two organisations, it shows that he still remained a Muslim and he still remained wedded to what I would call loosely black nationalist ideas. But nevertheless, he was moving leftwards and amongst the final platforms that he was speaking on, and was being given a platform for both public speaking and for his writings and publications, were left-wing organisations, particularly an organisation called the Socialist Workers' Party in America at that time. And therefore he was beginning to see, and the comrade here who's got a fantastic t-shirt on, perhaps stand and let people see it.
Modeling's good.
You show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker. Beginning to realise, making the links between racist oppression and the wider exploitation of people in society. And as I say, he predicted that America was ready to explode. Sadly, he never lived to see it because he died in February 1965. He was assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, almost certainly at the hands of members of the Nation of Islam. Just 39 years old. that brings me on to the Black Panthers, because this was an organisation that was established in Oakland, California by two ex-students, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, and when they set up the Black Panthers, they did so, in their terms, in the spirit of Malcolm, to try and build on Malcolm's legacy. Their strategy was primarily to build up the self-organisation and self-confidence of people in black communities to fight back against their oppressors. And the immediate starting point for them was to take on the most obvious and immediate oppressors of black people, the people who oppress people on the streets in their communities, the police. And so one of their key strategies was to, I think it was Newton, wasn't it, who was an ex-law student who had studied the Constitution, realised that people had the right to bear arms, and therefore a key part of their strategy was to encourage people to exercise their constitutional right to bear arms, and to say to the police, you come to our communities and try and oppress us, we're going to take you on by patrolling the pigs. We're going to drive you out of our communities. But it's important, and much of, see the images of them there. They look fantastically cool, by the way, don't they? Much of the kind of iconography about the Panthers is focused on this particular strategy of patrolling the pigs. It was the most dramatic example of what they did, but it wasn't, and it's important that people are aware of it. It wasn't the only thing that they did. Amongst the other things that they did was that they set up breakfast clubs for young kids before they went to school. They set up education classes and so on. And the aim of all of that, they said, was to provide a lifeboat to guarantee the survival of black communities whilst we're struggling against the oppressor until we win the fight, the ultimate fight against racism. So they didn't just patrol the pigs. They had a community programme. They also had, how long have I got?
12 minutes.
Fantastic. They also had a 10-point programme. I'll just go through the programme. They said we want freedom, we want the power to determine the destiny of our black community. We want full employment for our people, and that's number 2. 3, we want an end to the robbery by the white man of our black community. 4, we want decent housing fit for shelter of human beings. 5, we want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches the true history and our role in the present day society. 6, we want black men to be exempt from military service. 7, we want an immediate end to police brutality and the murder of black people. 8, we want freedom for all black men held in federal, state, county and city prisons. 9, we want all black people who are brought to trial to be tried in court by a jury of their peers or people from the black communities as defined by the Constitution of the United States. 10, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice and peace. And as our major political objective, a United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the black colony in which only black colonial subjects will be allowed to participate for the purpose of determining the will of black people as to their destiny. Now the Panthers were an incredibly courageous organisation, taking on the police in that way, incredibly courageous. They were also hugely influential. At their height, they had an estimated 10,000 members. They sold 100,000 copies of their paper, The Black Panther, across America. I'm not sure whether we sell 100,000 copies of Socialist Worker. Probably not. Probably not. And a survey that was conducted suggested that 25% of black people in America supported them. So hugely popular and influential in that sense, but sadly it was a popularity which was short-lived, and therefore, having been set up in '66, really by the early 1970s it was an organisation that really pretty much ceased to exist. Why was that? Partly because, well, firstly and precisely because they were so popular, so radical, and therefore so dangerous, the American authorities were determined to destroy them. Frightened and determined to destroy them, and therefore the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, declared them public enemy number one and launched a counterintelligence program that was determined to destroy the organisation. Now, of course, we've learnt a thing or two in the last few weeks, haven't we, about spying and the dirty tricks that our own authorities are happy still to engage in. Well, back then, the FBI, of course, spying, agent provocateur, these kind of activities were central to the way in which they took on the Panthers and, of course, King, the civil rights movement and any opposition groups. But they also relied upon smears and threats and literally murder. They literally took to the streets and butchered, murdered, assassinated leading figures from the Black Panthers, including Fred Hampton and Bunchy Carter. Others were imprisoned. Both Seal and Newton were imprisoned. Fantastic campaigns involving black and white people to get them released, by the way, which hopefully people can talk about. Others, such as Eldridge Cleaver, were driven into exile. So the FBI succeeded in destroying the organisation through a process of infiltration, fomenting tension, violent butchers and murders and so on. I want to pause there for a minute, because if, for example, you see Mario Van Peebles did a film called Panther a few years ago, quite a while ago now, and there was also a very impressive, more recently, the Black Power mixtape, which people may have seen. One of the arguments that is presented there is that the flooding of drugs into black communities was central to the demise of organisations like the Panthers. I do not underestimate the significance of that. Unquestionably, it was part of the strategy, and the butchery and murder of leading Panthers was a central part of the strategy. But I do think, and it pains me as someone who adores the Panthers to say this, but we have to say, quite critically, that there were huge weaknesses and flaws in their own strategy that we have to discuss. Incredibly courageous though they were, they failed to build upon the mass support that they had. I think partly because the focus on the brothers on the block, focusing on the most oppressed, what they called the lumpen proletariat, an idea developed by Cleaver from the ideas of Frantz Fanon, meant that rather than focusing on people where they're at their strongest, where they're at their most united, in a sense they were focusing on people where they're at their most disparate, the most disorganised in their communities. But also, really, in seeking to focus the brothers on the block, what the Panthers were doing were literally seeking to create professional Panthers, if you like. You had to come away from your family, come away from the community, and live as a Panther with other Panthers. Therefore, serving the community, doing things for the community, rather than organising the self-activity of people. So, it's understandable, but I think it was a huge weakness. They didn't build upon the mass support that they had in that way. They had no focus whatsoever upon organised workers. And therefore, and also a word about the community programmes. Fantastically successful in many ways, and hugely supported though they were. If you think about it, they pull you in a slightly different direction to revolutionary activity and an organisation. It's, a huge effort required to organise the classes, to organise the food kitchens and so on, draws you in a kind of reformist direction, collaborating with elements of the state who you can work with and so on, rather than focusing on your wider revolutionary goals. But also, just if you think about that final major objective, that 10th point of their political programme, the idea that the United Nations was going to be some kind of forum through which you could organise and plan and establish the liberation of black people, really, I have to say, was something of a pipe dream. To move on, because time is running out. It's not simply with the benefit of hindsight that I argue that there should and could have been a focus upon organised workers. The truth is that there were black revolutionaries, black radicals who did precisely that, and who therefore, I think, built upon and went further than the Panthers. It should come as no surprise that the spirit of radical rebellion, of anger, of bitterness, a determination to change wasn't restricted to the students in the civil rights movement, wasn't restricted to the ghettos where black people lived, but also had a focus in the factories where black people worked. Yes, of course, black people were disproportionately unemployed in the ghettos and so on, but huge numbers of black people were employed in workplaces. In particular, in an area like Detroit, the heart of the motor industry, there were huge numbers. 25% of the people in the factories were black workers. And there were black radicals who worked in those factories who said what we need to do is organise black people where we're strongest at the point of production. And therefore they sought to mobilise, against the injustices in the workplace, lack of promotion, worse jobs, lower wages, and so on, and therefore to build a radical movement out of that. I don't have time, I need to move on. I'll just very quickly quote something, which is what one of the leaders of Drum, and what then became the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, argued. In one factory we have 10,000 people who are faced with the same brutal conditions as exist outside. When you go out into the community, the interests of the people are going to be much more dispersed. Therefore, just in terms of expediency, there are greater possibilities in the organisation of the plant. The kind of action which can be taken in the community are not as effectively damaging to the ruling class as the kinds of actions which can be taken in the plant. In other words, a realisation that the fight against racism, there was a link between the communities, the ghettos and the factories. The point at which the struggle could be strongest was if that fight was taken into the factories. So that's what they sought to do. I'm going to move on because I want to allow time for debate and discussion. So I'm going to just put the point about Drum out there and the point about focusing on black workers, black and white workers together, as being a critical part of the struggle out there for debate and discussion. I want to really finish by saying this. Therefore, by the end of the 1960s, what we had seen, therefore, was the civil rights movement that I began with growing over into something more radical, more militant, and based not just in the southern states, as the civil rights movement primarily had been, but moving into the northern states where there was more organised workers, more factories, more workplaces that could be organised, and so on. And the effect of that radical development wasn't just felt in the sphere of immediate politics. It had a wider cultural effect. You've seen, for example, this fantastic image of the 1968 Olympics. And by the way, comrades, you can get your own copy of that because the Spanish comrades are selling posters of it at the end, which you should get a copy of. That 1968 Olympics, Tommy Smith and John Carlos winning their medals and identifying very much so with the movement for black power and black struggle that existed. Oh, and by the way, this athlete as well, the Australian who came second, is wearing the same human rights badge as the two black athletes because he identified with their struggle as well. And when he died a few years ago, Smith and Carlos were pallbearers at his funeral. In the sphere of music, people like Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, Otis Redding, and James Brown moving in an interesting radical direction, getting rid of their white bandmates in some cases and having black-only bands, an interesting development that's worth discussing. Indicative of the way in which it's influencing different ideas. The title of our book, Say It Loud I'm black and say it loud. Rest of the title, I'm Black and I'm Proud, is the title of a James Brown record. Interesting things to say about James Brown and what he had to say after the death of Martin Luther King. People may want to discuss that. But indicative of how it had that the increase in struggle had a wider effect, a wider ripple effect on society. Finally, the question of legacy. Because it wasn't just that those struggles led to legislation, Civil Rights Act and so on. The ultimate effect, I think, of the struggles of the 1960s was that it burst open a space for black people to move into positions of power and authority and of influence. So therefore, just to give you some examples, in the 1964, before the civil rights legislation had really come into effect, there were something like 100 black elected officials across the whole of America. By 1990, there were over 9,000. And these weren't just parish councillors. These were mayors, these were district attorneys, these were governors of major states and of cities. And also you had a black middle class people running and controlling big businesses, multi-million dollar businesses and so on. You had Supreme Court justices, one of whom, a guy called Clarence Thomas, elected by Ronald Reagan, who incidentally, and this is illustrative of how this was a direct consequence of the struggles of the civil rights and the Black Power movement. In the 1968, Thomas wore the black beret of the Black Panthers, signed his name X, and considered, I think he said the Panthers weren't radical enough. Once he was elected as a Supreme Court judge by Ronald Reagan, this was a man who was calling his own sister a welfare queen because she wasn't in work. She wasn't in work because she was nursing their sick mother, but he was, taking that kind of right-wing agenda. Of course, and since then we've seen black secretaries of state, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, who I mentioned earlier, and of course the image that we have now, the man who is in the White House, Barack Obama. Something which many of us will have celebrated in 2008, really destroying the idea that black people, Public Enemy had a song about how you could never, you'd never see a black president and so on. Well, we have a black president now. The final point I want to make is this, that of course, Gary Young had some figures in The Guardian quite recently about the levels of unemployment and poverty, the growing inequality that we have seen under Barack Obama over the last 4.5 years, really blowing apart the idea that simply having black faces in high places, politicians, business people and so on, is in itself going to lead to the liberation of black people. And actually, one of the things that Marable talks about in his book is what he calls the hip-hop generation. Those young people who were born and brought up since really the turn of the millennium. And he uses that term quite deliberately because what he argues is that they're people who, in a sense, reflect so much of what rap music reflects. There's an energy, there's an anger, there's a frustration in there. A bitterness at the betrayal that these young people have experienced, often directly at the hands of the people who benefited from the civil rights and black power struggles. It is often directly those people who became professors, who became police chiefs, who became district attorneys and governors as a result of those struggles, who are now the people who are sending the cops into the ghettos, cutting education and college programs and so on, cutting jobs and destroying the life chances of those young people. So what Marable talks about is the energy and anger that you often hear in some of the best hip-hop, but at the same time, there's the rage, but there's at the same time the kind of incoherence that often leads to some really quite negative ideas and so on. So what are the challenges for us? I think the challenges are that we take huge inspiration from both the civil rights and the Black Power movement, from Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the Panthers and drama. But of course we haven't achieved the liberation of black people, and therefore of course we have to learn and discuss and debate what the real way forward is if we are once and for all going to put this scourge beyond us forever.
Good afternoon, comrades. My name is Malcolm. Malcolm Kennedy, a name also mentioned in that thing. Another man in America also brutally murdered in the 1960s. When I switched on the radio this morning, there was a piece of bad news. The guy that killed Trayvon Martin has been acquitted of the crime, and that is a moral outrage. The speaker said it's 2 weeks since we were talking about the situation with people spying on Doreen Lawrence and so forth and so on, but it seems that not only is it very difficult for a teenage young black boy to get justice in the UK. We should try Florida, and it's even worse over there. Secondly, on a slightly upbeat note from that downbeat note that I made now, in conjunction with what the Nation of Islam thought about the origins of white people coming from the spaceship or wherever it was that they came from, all of the white and Asian and South American people in this audience all came from one place, and that was Kenya 70,000 years ago. All of the Afro-Caribbean people came from one place, and that was Kenya 100,000 years ago. Yeah? So we're all, every single one of us in this room, descended from Africa. Remember that. And pass that message on. Anytime that you come across the BNP or the EDL or any of these malicious racist scumbags that you see, tell that person, so if you're talking to Nick Griffin or Tommy Robinson or one of those people, remember, your ancestors came from Africa too.
Yeah, Conway's absolutely right. We're all Africans. I just want to draw out some of the lessons from the history of the civil rights movement and the Panthers in terms of how we actually win, how we actually going to get rid of racism. And I think it's because both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were serious about the possibility of getting rid of racism. They really wanted to do it. They really wanted to build a movement that could succeed. It led them to actually reconsider some of their ideas. So, it's no accident that Martin Luther King, who some people like to kind of counterpose to the more radical Malcolm X, but actually Martin Luther King, because he was serious about wanting to go forward in terms of uprooting, getting rid of racism in America, he actually broke with the Kennedys, he actually broke with the Democratic Party, and you can see it quite clearly on questions like Vietnam. Before anyone else came out and spoke about Vietnam, there was people like Martin Luther King saying, no, this is an unjust war, a war that we should have nothing to do with. He started to understand that there was a social system called capitalism that generated racism, and therefore it would be important for the civil rights movement, for the black movement, to start to try and find allies among the white people. And so it's no accident when he's shot dead in Memphis, he's at a strike of workers, sanitation workers, dustbin men, and that many women. So he was starting to move in a class direction. I'm not saying he was a rounded socialist, whatever, but he was moving in a socialist direction. He was moving towards understanding of class politics. Again, the same with Malcolm X, moving away from a position of separatism, as Brian described, to one way he talked about the John Browns, which is a reference to a white American preacher who went down south to split open the heads of the slavers and to create a slave insurrection, or to help the black people start a slave insurrection. Unfortunately, he failed. But there were John Browns that actually did join in the Black American Revolution, which was actually more of a social revolution that included not just black people, but actually all the other social movements, the women's movement and so on, the anti-war movement, and actually the creation of actually a radical left, of which the black movement was a part. I think the only problem that we had is we didn't go far enough, and as Brian showed in the case of DRUM, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, which is really, really fantastic because they found that they realised that actually capitalism is built on profits, and while we can actually stop their profits, that's where we have our power. They understood that, but at the same time, it didn't go as far as to actually organise among the white workers. So they organised. They were very advanced. They had capital reading groups where they studied Karl Marx and the workings of capitalism and read the book and try to get to grips with all of that. These people called themselves Marxists, as did many Panthers, but it didn't go as far as to actually understand that actually the industrial working class, black and white, has an interest in fighting together against racism because it's against the interests of white workers. And part of the reason why I didn't have that I wasn't there is because the people that didn't used to argue that had black and white members right across America, and were the most consistent anti-racists ever in the United States of America was the Communist Party. They were wrong about Russia and stuff, but they were very, very good on fighting racism. And they built an organisation which, in Harlem, for example, had thousands of black members who were communists, and they worked together with the white communists. And actually, it's not an accident, but McCarthy and the American ruling class destroyed the Communist Party in America. And because that was destroyed, there was a gap. So although there were people who were ex-communists in the civil rights movement, they weren't out-communists. So that tradition of a kind of an orientation on industrial workers and seeing where the power was in society was missing in America. That's why there was that gap. But there were still people there, and there was still a possibility, you can see today, actually building a serious cross-class, cross-racial alliance of black and white together. Malcolm, Obama shows actually how far the movement went, and actually they're resting on the shoulders of the struggles of the past, but also that actually you can actually begin to break down racism. Racism is still alive and well, but actually many white workers overcame their racism to vote for Obama. That's a step forward. With understanding also that Obama actually represents the defeat of the civil rights movement and of that radical tradition. So we've got to rebuild it, but the possibilities are very pregnant at the moment because the revolution will come to America as it is in Egypt.
Thank you.
My name's Carol. I'm going to be terribly arrogant and personalise it. In the 70s, a man who was I thought a very angry black man came knocking at my door, and he said to me, "Would you like to do something about racism? Would you like to fight against racism?" "Yes," I said, "I really would. I really believe I'm a great anti-racist." He came in, he looked at me, he looked at my now ex-husband, and he said, "Well, you're no good, you're useless." I said, "Well, what do you mean? What do you mean?" He said, "Well, not to put too fine a point on it, you've got a drug problem, haven't you?" I very reluctantly said, yeah. He said, "We've got no time for addicts. You are a waste of time." However, the Panthers had methods, the Panthers had ways to help people come off drugs. We have helped a lot of people. It's going to be tough, it's going to be nasty, we won't pamper you in any way, but if you want to come and fight against racism, you come, you stay with me and my wife for 3 days and we'll help you. And I'm not going to ramble on about this. I thought to myself, Angela Davis, I really admire you, the different Panthers, I really admire them. I said, yes, I'll take the chance, I was 28, I'm now 64, I haven't used since. So, I'm very, very selfish thinking, but what I was told about the Panthers is they've got discipline, they believe in themselves, they believe in a better future for everyone. Not only black people, what we say was the Black Panthers, no. They were, from almost the beginning, they had white members and they believed in equality and equity for everybody. I'm sure that's what everybody in this hall believes in as well. Thank you.
When I sort of learned about the the civil rights movement and the struggle that occurred there, particularly because it was through education, and obviously the education system is essentially controlled by the ruling class. We learned this kind of conception that of the civil rights movement, that there was almost this act of contrition by capitalism, whereby they were shown the error of their ways, like by just the peaceful protests of the civil rights movement. But this often ignores the actual massive impact that that having organisations like the Black Panthers and Black Power movement actually had, because obviously with the historical struggle in America, so the racist riots that were happening all the time, America at war in Vietnam, you know, a huge proportion of their military was black and Hispanic people, and they were out fighting this imperialist war while back home their family and their friends were being victimised systematically. And it was through organisations like the Black Panthers and through people like Malcolm X that were saying we need to stand up for ourselves and we need to fight back and we need to take up this armed struggle against the establishment. The establishment started thinking, hang on a minute, this isn't viable. How are we going to make these people fight for us if they're back at home fighting the police and stuff like this? And so it was actually, a large part of the ability for the brilliant peaceful civil rights movement to be victorious was actually also this armed struggle as well, which kind of forced them into this position where they had to compromise. There was no real point apart from, that we need the struggle and we need the ability to fight at times violently against the oppression of the ruling class.
Thank you. Well, I think you can have now. Yeah, at the back. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Billy Hamill. I'm a new member of the SWP.
Yeah.
I think things like discrimination and racism, they're just plain dirty. What do people get out of life from being racist? It's not good to discriminate against blacks. They're just humans, just like us. And I think, yeah. Right, I've seen recently, over the last couple of years, because I'm a football fan, two people, Luis Suarez and John Terry, they've been racist, and I don't think that's good. Luis Suarez said, actually quoted himself, it was alright to say that, to discriminate against black people in Uruguay. So it's not just happening in places like America, it's starting to become global.
Come. And then you.
Thank you. My name is Sayer. I'm not a member of the SWP, but I'm blessed to be here. This is my first Marxism conference. The reason why I'm standing here is I had a passion for the topic to the point where I spent 10 years researching and doing a PhD on Malcolm X. So I'm very, very taken up by your presentation. And I kind of would like to kind of just say 2 or 3 things, basically, because you talk about legacy, of this movement. And it seems to me that there are 2 publications that came in the 90s and the 60s, 2 books. One by Wolfenstein called Malcolm X and the Black Liberation Struggle, which is a Marxist analysis of the work of Malcolm X. And I think we need to go back to that publication. And also another one that Louis E. Lomax did in the 60s, who was a journalist, a very good friend of Malcolm and Martin Luther King, called To Kill a Black Man, which is a comparative study of how the system has destroyed the leadership of the movement. So I think those 2. And a third thing is a film made by a black British filmmaker called John O'Confer called 7 Songs for Malcolm X. Some of you may have seen that. So I think to add to this brilliant presentation, this topic, those things excavate the legacy. Now I would like to go to two more points and I'll be done. One is the term Orthodox Islam in relation to the Nation of Islam. Given that it's a black nationalist organization, which has nothing to do with Islam, now that 30, 40, 50 years, I don't know, after the demise of that narrative, maybe in our day and time, when we talk about solidarity and struggle and Islamophobia, we need to rethink that term, Orthodox Islam, related to this movement. I think they were a black nationalist organization, and again, they were very well aware of class, because they were building a black middle class and a black capitalist elite led up to corruption and the demise of the organization. So they were not unaware of class solidarity and the power of class. I think I need to put that on the agenda. The other thing is Malcolm X's move towards the left. Yeah, I'm summing up. It's my last point. Malcolm X's move towards the left. I think if you look at the Caribbean connection through his mother in the struggle there, and there is a historian who passed away, who was in London, Jan Carew, wrote a book called Ghosts in Our Blood, which is all about Malcolm, Africa and the Caribbean, the Pan-African movement. Then the left, Malcolm came into the nation with the leftist agenda. That's my argument. But that's a rupture. That sort of, when he came back, it's not kind of he was moving, no, he was returning to the left. That's my argument. Last but not least, the Panthers. Part of their problem, the struggle of the Panthers, was that they're so wrapped up with the American Constitution. This is a quintessential American kind of movement. When they started being international, it was a bit too late with Eldridge Cleaver. They were law students. It was about America. That's why they couldn't see the complexity of the movement on a Pan-African basis.
After this comrade, we'll be our last speaker. Yeah, please, it's 2 minutes contributions now, so we've got to give Brian time to sum up. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to ask 2 questions, one for myself. Well, the Socialist Worker Party is dominated by white people. Just want to know what is off-putting about it for non-white people, and if there's not an answer to that question, what can make it more appealing? The other question was from a friend at the back. She wanted to know how Malcolm X had influenced people in England at the time.
I'm sorry I couldn't get any more in, we're running a bit late and I've got to get Brian back.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Henry Smith and it's the first Marxist event I've ever attended. 2 questions for Brother Brian and for ourselves. We've got history behind us in many respects regarding the events that's taken place. At present, my question is this: how do we as society plan to deal with racism, white supremacy?
Thanks, Sam, and thanks for all the contributions. I'm going to start actually by thanking Andy, who's been responsible for the slides that you've seen. I hope people have had an opportunity to look at the slides whilst we've been running this meeting, because I think it's a fantastic treasure trove and archive of some of the struggles and battles that people have waged against racism, because of course that's the important starting point, that racism has been and remains deeply rooted in American society. The White House itself was built by slaves, but throughout that time there has always been resistance against racism, and the images we've shown have been attempts to show some of the key figures and some of the key struggles against racism. And actually, much of this stuff is in some of the brilliant literature that you'll find. There's a wonderful, some of the images that Andy has shown are some of the cartoons done by Emery Douglas, a key figure in the Panthers. There is a fantastic book of his work and some of the writings and philosophy of the Panthers. You can probably get it at Bookmark, so do go along and have a look at that. Do buy the poster. Do get Manning Marable's fantastic biography of Malcolm X. It's absolutely brilliant. And I do hope that you'll buy our book, Say It Loud, because we do attempt in the book to address many of these questions. The book is primarily a history of Britain over the last 40 years, and I mentioned that in relation to one of the last questions that was raised about how we can make our organisation more appealing. But it does go through, I'll come back to that, but it does go through, because the struggles in America have been so important and so influential in terms of shaping people's ideas and shaping so many of the struggles, not just in America, but here in Britain and elsewhere, that we do go in some detail into some of those struggles. Gary talked about how the communists built an incredible movement, how they, the campaign to support the Scottsboro boys that it talks about, a campaign to organise agricultural workers in the South, a fantastic, history of commitment. We talk about that in the book, and there's a chapter as well by Yuri Prasad which quite specifically goes through many of the movements like Drum, the Black Panthers, Malcolm, and so on. So I do hope that you'll buy the book and read more about it. And on the question of Britain, when we were writing this book, one of the things that really struck home to me is how and I'm just looking at really the period since the 1970s, in this country, there has been, of course, there remains deeply entrenched racism. It was exposed, wasn't it, by the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the depth of institutional racism. And we continue to see, as people have talked about in this meeting, how the Lawrences continue to struggle to get any real justice, how racism remains deeply embedded. The outcome we heard this week about Jimmy Mubenga and the way in which he was treated when the police were trying to deport him shows the depths of racism. And one of the things that struck me when we were writing this book is how, at the same time as that racism, there has also been fantastic resistance against it, enormously inspiring struggles. And socialists have been at the heart of those struggles. I remember when I joined the Socialist Workers' Party in Manchester in 1987, so I'm showing how old I am. And I remember one of the reasons was I was at university at the time, and there was 2 women had been murdered in a park near to the university and in the area that backs onto Moss Side, which is one of the central areas where black people live in Manchester. And I remember very distinctly, at first the police went into the community and asked people to help them to find the killers of these 2 women. And then within days, their attitude had completely turned round and they were smashing down doors in dawn raids, arresting people and harassing people. I remember a demonstration being organised, which the SWP went along to the meetings, helped to organise the demonstration. And then when the demonstration happened, there were loads of SWP members there and hardly anyone from the local community. And I remember thinking, why aren't these people out protesting? And why is it just these people who are here? And I remember joining the organisation then and actually feeling proud that the organisation was standing up and was part of that struggle. And I've never left it since that day. But of course, I felt then, and I still feel now, a sense of frustration that more people aren't involved. That frustration that after the riots 2 years ago, more people didn't join the organisation. But that doesn't mean to say that that there isn't a history of involvement by socialists, and our organisation, of which I'm proud to be a member, central involvement in those struggles. Take, for just as an example, the Stephen Lawrence family campaign, the most important and the most inspiring example of struggle in the last 20 or 30 years. And of course, at the heart of that has been the determination. People talk about the dignity of the Lawrence family. Yes, they're incredibly dignified. Doreen Lawrence is possibly the most dignified person I have ever met. But she is also one of the most defiant and the most determined to have fought for all those years, long, hard years, against the injustice that her family experienced. Obviously, they were at the heart of the struggle to get justice for their son. And of course, they had a brilliant legal team. I'm a lawyer myself. I've had the privilege of working with Michael Mansfield. He is a brilliant barrister, but their campaign would have not kept going, would not have achieved what it's achieved. They admit this themselves if they hadn't had support from the local community and from working class people and organised workers going into their workplaces, doing the collections that kept the campaign going, getting resolutions through their union branches, going to their national conferences and going to the TUC conference and saying that whatever support this family needs to underwrite its campaign, we must give it to them. That has come about through us putting into, not just the Socialist Workers' Party, socialists and political activists putting into practice what we believe, which is that black and white working class unity is the key to change. It was the key to change in helping that family to keep going through those long, hard years. And the challenge for us, I think, is every time that there is a struggle, every time there is, a racist incident, riots, things like that, that we help to be centrally involved, being the tribunes of the oppressed, but also arguing for a strategy that can take these things forward, that can make sure, as we talked about, that we don't just fight off every manifestation of racism, but that ultimately we build a strategy that can put an end to all forms of oppression and of exploitation once and for all. Actually, the reason why we've written this book, the reason why we have put the pictures in the book that we've put in, is to illustrate in practice how black and white unity has, can and will be achieved. Just another, I know I'm going over, but one other example I just want to bring is the example of Abdul and his son Ade Onibaya, because of course we've heard the terrible story of what happened to Ginny Lubenga. I am proud, one of the things that I'm most proud about, people that I've worked with, were members of our organisation and others who were members of Lambeth Unison, who campaigned not to, Abdul and Ade Onibaya had been deported. They had been deported to Nigeria. That campaign, amongst trade unionists, led by socialist activists, got those people back into this country. Fantastic example. Small, but a fantastic example. Those are the kind of small victories that we can achieve. We need to do so much more than that. But of course, I think the potential is there. You think about what we need to go into, the struggle to defend our public services. Think about the National Health Service. The fight to defend the National Health Service necessarily means black and white workers together working with their local communities to fight to defend the National Health Service. The strikes in November 2011 was the biggest huge mobilisation of public sector workers, was of course also the biggest mobilisation of women workers, a huge mobilisation of black and white workers together. It was through building those struggles, but in building those struggles, seeking, as socialists, to carry an argument about how we can put an end to these things once and for all, that I think is the key to change. Just very finally, what I do hope, as a very specific strategic thing, is that in October, it's Black History Month, we will have a tour in as many towns and cities as we possibly can. Let's have a tour of this book. Let's have Black History Month meetings and let's debate and discuss with people the way forward. I hope through that we will recruit people to the SWP and that it will become a blacker organisation than the one that it currently is. Because I'm proud that we have got good, active, confident black members, but we haven't got enough. We haven't got enough white members, to be honest. I want more members of the SWP, full stop. So anyone who's not a member, you can add to our organisation by joining, as this young man has done today. Recruitment forms here, and go back to your communities, your workplaces, your college, build the struggle, and let's recruit more people to the SWP.